Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing really, really well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And it's really weird to think that we really are in the beginning of the year. It's still pretty quiet around where I live, but I think things are going to get a lot busier by next week. And it's good to start the year with so many lovely, exciting Bigfoot stories to share with you. So now we're on part 3 of our story tonight, and what an exciting story it is. Karen is asking her grandfather, "Do you believe in Bigfoot, Grandpa Elk?" And then he begins to tell her a story about one of his very good friends, a man called Rick Sullivan, who had a rather bizarre encounter with a Bigfoot. Because Karen is bracing herself to tell her grandfather that there is a Bigfoot that is nesting in their barn. Let's get started with part 3 of our story tonight. It would seem that Rick Sullivan had always been very lucky in regards to his fishing jaunts. He usually returned home with a sizable catch that he proudly showed off to his beloved wife. He considered the creek to be well stocked with an abundance of catfish, halibut, lingcod and rainbow trout. However, on this particular day, as delightful as it was, every attempt that Rick made when casting out his line was feeble, to say the very least. Rick contemplated going to the off-the-dock fishmongers in town on Broad Street and clandestinely buying some fish to bring home to his wife, passing them off as his own, for he was feeling significantly crushed for being so unsuccessful that day. Every time he cast out a line, nothing appeared to be biting. He began to curse under his breath, as you do. He felt rather frustrated, while he silently prayed for a miracle, like when Jesus told his disciples to cast out a net, and they pulled in so much fish that the net practically broke under the weight of it all. Somehow Rick knew that this was not going to happen for him. But he was hoping for a small, merciful breakthrough on this fishing expedition that so far had been both unfruitful and extremely unenjoyable at the very same time. Rick had been unable to relax, for he felt pressurized by the promise he had made to his wife. He didn't want to let her down, so his fishing trip had become more like a chore than a pleasurable adventure. That is, I'm afraid, what happens when you put too much pressure on yourself. It can make the cookie just crumble in your hands. I've experienced that often enough myself, let me tell you. "Poor Rick! I hope he managed to catch something in the end," said Karen. "Well, he tried his best, didn't he?" Grandpa Elk admitted. "But it would seem his best was not good enough." Rick cast out his line again into the water, but as usual nothing happened. By this time he had already decided to call it a day, as he'd had enough of attempting to fish without any reward. Rick told me that he had never felt like this before, but his wife's demands had cruelly confiscated the enjoyment of that day. I understand from what he shared with me that it was an arrestingly beautiful day. The tall, lofty trees surrounding the creek were alive with pretty birdsong, and the rich, magnanimous bounty of spring was seen in all its glory, with the viridescent green scenery and the shade-loving flowering plants that were growing abundantly around the creek and the pier. Rick said he finally made the decision that a clandestine trip to the fishmongers to pick up some fish for his wife was well in order, as he was far too proud to tell his wife that he had not caught anything, because, like many men, he hated disappointing her. "Well, I guess that makes lots of sense," said Karen. "I mean, I've never had a father, but I can see that you, Gramps, are always trying to please Granny Dora." "You're exactly right, Karen. We men can be gluttons for punishment at the best of times, if you ask me. By nature, Rick Sullivan is quite a proud, accomplished person. So that fishing trip, which was something he normally enjoyed, had become rather irksome, rather like someone who enjoys baking very much. Normally they produce outstanding cakes, as if it's effortlessly easy for them. But one day, sadly, all the cakes flop, and the accomplished cook feels as flat and demoralized as the flopped cake themselves that have come out of the oven. Perhaps the cook is wondering, did they put baking powder in the ingredients, or did they forget to do so? Perhaps they hadn't put the right amount of eggs in there, or perhaps the flour was of a poor quality. But things like that happen to us all, and it's human nature for us to feel a sense of failure when things don't turn out like we expected them to, and you've failed to rise up to your normal high standards. It can be very demoralizing, to say the very least, when things come to nothing."
"Well, I know the feeling well," Grandpa Karen admitted. "I always make fudge at home, you see. But one time my fudge turned into toffee. I felt like such a failure because I was teaching my best friend Lisa how to make fudge. I was trying to show off how accomplished I was at it. And it embarrassingly went all funny and refused to set. I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong, because never once has that happened to me, Grandpa. I was making the fudge with Lisa for a school fete, but after 3 botched, failed attempts at making fudge, Mum had to run out to the local candy shop for us, and we bought some fudge to pass off as our own. I felt like such a fraud, I really did, and Lisa didn't believe I could make fudge at all. She thought I lied about it. The following week, when she wasn't around, I made 3 perfect batches of fudge, which I took to school to show her, but Lisa refused to believe I'd actually made it."
"There you go then, love. You now understand how poor Rick Sullivan was feeling that day," said Grandpa Elk. "He was such a good fisherman, let me tell you. But for some reason, he found himself about to return home with fish that had been bought from on-the-dock fishmongers, because he couldn't bear to return home empty-handed to his wife, and to see the dreadful disappointment on her face. Nothing makes a man feel more unaccomplished than that, let me tell you."
"So what happened next?" asked Karen, eyeing her grandfather curiously, as she wondered where a Bigfoot would fit into this rather bizarre story.
"Well, where was I?"
"You were saying that Rick was feeling bad because he couldn't catch any fish to bring home to his wife, and he was thinking of cheating by buying the fish at on-the-dock fishmongers in town, like I bought the fudge at the candy store, to pass off as my own."
"Ah, yes, now I remember. Well, as Rick was throwing out his rod into the water, a voice suddenly came into his head and said, 'Don't bother. Nothing's biting for you today. The fish aren't easily fooled by your beleaguered, pathetic attempts. You're not doing well, my friend. Not today, anyway. Not by a long shot, I'm afraid. You're not your usual proficient self today, are you? You've been on edge all morning, so the fish know you're there. They're not fooled for a single second. Even fish are intelligent, you know. You've given yourself away. You keep nervously bumping that rod of yours, jiggling it up and down. You've scared them all away." Rick was extremely shocked to hear the strange voice in his head. He wondered where it had come from, for it was certainly not his own. He looked around and about himself, and wondered if he was going completely stark-raving mad. Not only had he been unable to fish that morning, but now his mind was playing tricks with him. Or was it? He couldn't be sure about that. He realized that whoever had spoken to him had been absolutely right in what they had said, as the more he worried about returning home without any fish, the more erratic and unstable his fishing had become. He hadn't even realized that he'd actually been trembling and shaking the rod, but as he looked down at his hand on the line, he realized it was rather unsteady and shaking like a leaf. Was it any wonder the fish weren't biting? His wife's demands for the dinner party that night had made him as shaky as a rocking chair, and he had no way of reining it all in. He knew that he needed to give up this fishing trip, for it had been a complete waste of his time. Rick looked around himself, wondering where the strange voice had come from. Then he heard the voice again. "You're not imagining things. I did speak to you. Your fishing technique today was lousy. Very lousy. You were all over the place. You've given yourself away on numerous occasions, as you kept casting out your line in such an ungainly, clumsy way. The fish aren't stupid, you know. But I do understand how you feel. It makes you feel pretty low returning home empty-handed, doesn't it? I'm happy to help out if I may." Rick looked around himself frantically. He sensed a spirited presence around him, and that someone was watching him, but he saw nothing. and so this paradoxical, outlandish experience became more and more bewildering for him. He was hearing a strange voice in his head, but where on earth was it coming from? Lo and behold, the next thing that Rick knew was that this huge 40-pound rainbow trout was thrown at his feet. And when I say huge, you cannot believe the size of this thing. It was flung in the air and landed inches away from him, slapping on the pier with a loud thud. He knew his wife would be very impressed with such a large catch. But where had this gift come from? This answer to his prayers? Rick looked around and about again to see who had sent him this manna from heaven. At first he saw absolutely nothing, and then a massive gargantuan-sized Bigfoot stepped into his line of vision, so that Rick was in no doubt of what he was seeing. At first he was so shocked and taken aback that he found himself gawking at the Bigfoot in disbelief, with bug-like eyes that were as wide as two saucers. He was persuading himself that what he was seeing with his naked eyes could not possibly be real, because it couldn't be, could it? But as he was thinking this, the voice came into his head all over again. The Bigfoot spoke to him telepathically, as if reading his every thought, with a pronounced fluency and understanding. "Don't doubt what you're seeing. Of course I'm real," the Bigfoot said. "Your eyes do not deceive you, my friend, although I dare say you would like to believe your mind is playing tricks on you, as many of your kind would generally like to assume. Such people will say to themselves, 'Did I just see that?' Then they will tell themselves, 'No, of course they did not. It was a mere trick of the light, wasn't it?' For the truth is far too idiosyncratic for them to even entertain. So no, your eyes do not deceive you." "Who are you?" Rick asked in his head, not expecting to receive an answer, but against all the odds an answer came. "My name is Zora. I've seen you fishing at this creek very often, but you've never seen me. You come here to let off steam, to relax, to enjoy yourself. But today you came to the creek with a heavy heart, as if you were carrying a huge burden on your shoulders, which is why your fishing went badly awry. The energy you gave off was so clipped with uncertainty. Was it any wonder you didn't catch a single thing? I know all about you. Your mind is like an open book that is very easy to read. In fact, your kind are all easy to read, and I can see the measure of a man by the energy he exudes. Yours is a kind and generous energy, of which I definitely approve. But you're also extremely serious, far too serious for your own good. It's very problematic to be like that. It can hold you back. You have to lighten up, my friend. The sky isn't going to fall on you tomorrow. I can assure you of that. You are a good man, which is why I've decided to help you out, which is why I sent that fish flying towards you. I'm a good shot, even if I say so myself. It landed next to your feet perfectly, as I aimed it to do so." Rick was in no doubt that if the Bigfoot had not wanted to be seen, it would have remained elusive, and he would never have seen him. For a moment he and the Bigfoot locked eyes. He said it was like he was drawn into those friendly eyes like a vortex, and he could see into their humorous depths, which he described as incredibly kind. He knew the Bigfoot had been watching him for quite a while, had been reading his thoughts. By all accounts, he had desperately tried to draw out of the water a sizable catch, and given he was unsuccessful, it would seem this unorthodox creature had decided to intervene on his account by offering him some help. But the fact that the Bigfoot had seen him fishing at the creek on multiple occasions came as quite a surprise to Rick. He never had felt that someone was watching him.
"Did he describe the Bigfoot to you, Grandpa?" Karen asked curiously.
But of course he did. He said that this imposing, majestic-looking Bigfoot was massive, both in girth and width, with extraordinary large, ponderous shoulders, overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head. But he said the dark, soulful eyes of the creature were filled with both humour and a tender warmth, and had it not been for the Bigfoot's eyes, Rick completely believes he would have been terrified out of his wits, for the creature was just massive. He said if he saw that creature from a distance, he'd likely have been scared out of his wits.
Wow, that is extraordinary, said Karen. That was so kind of the Bigfoot to give Rick a huge fish like that. The creature clearly had so much compassion. Thanks to the Bigfoot, Rick Sullivan didn't have to return home empty-handed. But I bet he'd never come home with a 40-pound fish before. His wife must have been over the moon. So how long did he stand there locking eyes with the Bigfoot, Grandpa?
Well, let's just say Rick told me that for a brief second he blinked. But when he looked up again, against all the odds, the Bigfoot had gone, all but vanished. He said he felt bitter disappointment, because the Bigfoot had gifted him with such an impressive-sized rainbow trout. He hadn't had an opportunity to thank the Bigfoot for his kindness. But you're right, Karen. When Rick returned home with his humongous catch that the Bigfoot had generously given him, his wife thought he was the quintessential hero for catching something so sizable. Indeed, she was absolutely ecstatic about the catch. Rick could not bring himself to tell his wife the truth, that it wasn't him who had caught this 40-pound trout.
"Why, I do believe, sweetheart, you're getting better at fishing by the day,"
his wife had said. And certainly everyone at the dinner party that evening said that the rainbow trout was the tastiest, most delicious fish that they'd ever eaten. So they all heartily praised Rick for his exemplary catch. A day after the fishing trip, Rick returned to the creek again, and his first attempts at fishing were successful, because he wasn't under any pressure that time.
Well, that doesn't surprise me, Gramps, at all. When there's no pressure on you, things just turn out smoothly, don't they? Like it did for me with the fudge. So did Rick ever see the Bigfoot again?
No, I'm sorry to say he never did, said Grandpa Elk, but he did tell me that on the day after the dinner party, he went straight to the creek and left a Tupperware container on the pier of his wife's raisin and oat cookies for the Bigfoot to eat. 2 days later, his wife comes into the kitchen as he's eating his breakfast and asks him why on earth he'd put a bird's nest in the Tupperware container and left it on the porch. At first, Rick didn't know what the hell his wife was on about, but then he recognized the Tupperware container as the one he'd left for the Bigfoot. So the bird's nest it contained, he knew at once, was a gift from the Bigfoot. His wife insisted he threw the bird nest away. She said it was filthy, but Rick discreetly hid it in the yard shed because he wanted to keep it. It was special to him, you see.
You mean the Bigfoot returned the Tupperware container to Rick's own house? He knew where Rick lived and gifted him with a bird's nest. That's absolutely incredible.
Well, that's just about right. He said the wife wasn't remotely amused by the bird's nest and told Rick never to bring dirty stuff home like that. She didn't understand what on earth was going on with him, why he was so interested in bringing birds' nests home.
That's amazing, Grandpa Elk. Do you believe his story? I know I absolutely do. You can't make stuff up like that unless, of course, you're C.S. Lewis.
Perfectly said, love. Perfectly said. I have no reason to doubt his story. Rick might be many things, but a liar he most certainly is not. And the way he was talking about this story to me in the bar, with his expression so incredibly animated, it was like when he told me the story he was reliving it again. He came completely alive. He was so eager to see Zorro again, but I'm not sure he ever will. And that, I think, has made him rather sad.
All of a sudden, Grandpa Elk looked adoringly at his granddaughter. There was curiosity edged in his bright blue eyes that twinkled with merriment, for he had thoroughly enjoyed sharing the story with Karen. He had not even told his own wife his friend's bizarre account, but he hadn't been able to resist telling the story to his granddaughter, and her response had been so animated, so Elk was glad to have shared it with her.
Why all these questions, love, if you don't mind my asking? What makes you interested in the subject of Bigfoot? If you must know, I haven't even told Rick's story to your grandmother. You see, I'm most sure she wouldn't believe a word of it. She'd likely think Rick was pulling my leg, and that I was an absolute fool to believe him. Your grandmother thinks I can be a tad gullible at times, but I'm the first to know if someone is spinning a yarn, and not for a second was Rick doing that to me. Come to think of it, I don't think he's the type that would take great pleasure in pulling anybody's leg. He's never been the humorous type, if you know what I mean. But I do get why Zorro told him he took life far too seriously, and should lighten up. The man is way too intense.
If you want to know, Grandpa, why I asked you about whether you believed in Bigfoot or not, it's because there's a Bigfoot seeking shelter in your barn right now, and I was hoping you would help it, because I believe it's in serious trouble. It's a wee little thing, only about 4 foot tall or so, covered with black hair. At that, Grandpa Elk let out a big chuckle, and pointed to his granddaughter with an even bigger twinkle in his eyes. You are good, love. You had me going there for a second. You're just like your grandmother. She's always winding me up like this. But I'm not that easily fooled, you know. I've got rather wise and discerning in my old age, and I know when someone's trying to pull a fast one over me. Grandpa Elk, you've got to listen to me. You have to listen to me. Look at me. Do I look as if I'm pulling your leg? I'm being deadly serious. You've got to believe me. I can swear on the Bible if you like, but I'm not making any of this up. I saw the little Bigfoot myself. He desperately needs our help. Please will you help him, Grandpa Elk? Something's seriously wrong with him. I know it is. I can feel it in my bones. You should have seen the way he was walking. He could barely stand on his 2 feet. He practically crawled on his hands and knees to get to the barn to escape the bad weather outside. Grandpa Elk suddenly sat bolt upright.
You're not winding me up, are you, love? There really is a sick little Bigfoot in the barn. And you think it needs help, is that right?
Karen nodded urgently. But it might be terribly afraid if you interact with it, she admitted. I doubt the creature has had any human contact before. He really liked the tinsel me and Granny Dora draped over the sapling. Even though he was very sickly, he was attracted to the shiny tinsel. He took it off the tree and put it around his neck, rather like a scarf. But it was stumbling. The Bigfoot was stumbling. He fell over a few times and practically crawled on his hands and knees back to the barn. He looked weak and confused. The bad weather drove him into the barn, I suspect, to take cover. I could tell he was a youngling, because he wasn't well built. He was lanky and thin and only about 4 foot tall. There was no sign of his parents anywhere around. Maybe he's lost or something. If you're sick enough, you can get so disorientated and confused, can't you? When I had that flu badly the winter before last, when I was staying with you and Granny Dora, I was all over the place, if you remember.
I need to check this out, said Grandpa Elk, rising very quickly to his feet.
Karen watched Grandpa Elk hurriedly putting on his boots and warm outer clothing, preparing himself to embrace the opposition out of doors, for the fearsome wind was unabashedly wailing across the tundra. Please can I come with you, Gramps? I think it's a good idea if I do, because the Bigfoot, being so little, might be intimidated by you. If I'm around you, maybe he'll feel more comfortable, because I'm small.
Very well, but the weather is very bad. Get warmly dressed, and we'll go out of doors, but hurry up. If your grandmother sees you going out with me in these formidable conditions, she'll have my guts for garters. I tell you what, tell your grandmother you're very hungry. Get her to make you a ham sandwich and some eggnog, and we'll take that out to the little mite. I'll take out my medical box with me along with a blanket or so, for the little Bigfoot to keep warm. It's freezing out there, let me tell you.
Karen was very glad that her grandfather believed her story, and that she had indeed seen the little Bigfoot. But it had been such a paradoxical, fleeting sighting that she was beginning to doubt what she'd seen. What if she was badly mistaken, and she had to drag her grandfather out in these ungodly conditions to brace the blizzard outside, only to find when they got to the barn the Bigfoot was nowhere to be seen, because it had just been a fragment of her own imagination. If that were the case, Grandpa Elk would not be best pleased with her joke. He'd say it had gone a step too far, even though it hadn't been a joke at all. But that's what he would believe it was. And that would be a cruel thing to do, dragging her grandfather out, I mean. For the cold weather certainly made his arthritis play up a great deal. I did see it, Karen told herself, glancing out at the sapling, to see that the silvery tinsel had indeed been removed by the little Bigfoot, and she was relieved to see it was missing from the tree, so it affirmed to her that she was indeed seeing accurately, and that the Bigfoot was real. The wind whipped across the tundra as Karen accompanied her grandfather, dressed in their outerwear, which included several layers of warm clothing and insulating puffer jackets that were very good at keeping in the warm. Granny Dora had made a ham sandwich for Karen and poured her a great big glass of eggnog, which Karen had clandestinely transferred to an empty Coca-Cola bottle that she had washed out in the bathroom and then filled with the eggnog. She picked out some fruit from the bowl in the living room, which included some fresh bananas and grapes, and she placed all the food in a little bag that she slung over her shoulders. Then, with her grandfather diligently at her side, they quickly made their way to the barn. Well, as quickly as they could, that is, closing the front door behind them as discreetly as possible, as they didn't want to arouse the attention of the overly protective and well-meaning Granny Dora, who would probably have kittens if she believed her granddaughter was caught out in the icy cold blizzard with her grandfather. Luckily, it would seem that Granny Dora was distracted getting her Christmas preparations out of the way, so she hadn't appeared to notice her two family members slipping out of the cabin into the ice-cold air. The Arctic ear pierced brazenly through her garments. Its insidious icy fingers certainly left Karen's teeth chattering furiously, and her fingers in her gloves feeling decidedly numb, almost as if they were about to fall off. She couldn't remember a time when she'd been this cold, but then again she'd never been foolish enough to go out in a blizzard before, for normally she'd stay wisely wrapped up warm indoors, seated by the warmth of a crackling fire. But the fate of the little Bigfoot overcame her reluctance to embrace these formidable elements. Even though the walk to the barn in normal weather conditions was pretty plain sailing, on a day like this, with the relentless winter weather behaving so badly and causing so much dreadful havoc across the tundra, that even a couple of trees in the grove had fallen over to their feet, collapsing like a couple of dead soldiers. The trip to the barn seemed to take an agonizingly long time, even though it was only a few minutes. But pushing up against the powerful resistance of the wind was challenging in itself. Once Karen and her grandfather reached the barn, they opened the door abruptly, and for a moment their eyes skimmed over the barn, but they saw nothing. Everything seemed to be in its perfect place, until Karen's eyes saw what looked like a big black rug lying across the corner of the room, in what seemed like a messy puddle. "That's him," she whispered to her grandfather, pointing out the puddle of hair on the floor. "I told you, he's a little Bigfoot. He came in here." Grandpa Elk and Karen walked very carefully towards the Bigfoot. It didn't appear to be moving, and Karen became unduly alarmed when she couldn't see the rise and fall of its little chest. What if the little Bigfoot was dead? Please God, no, she thought. Karen drew in a deep breath as she saw her grandfather leaning over to examine the little Bigfoot. He began touching it very gently and speaking to it in a low, reassuring voice. "We mean you no harm, little one. I'm just checking your vitals to see if you're all right. My granddaughter here saw you coming into the barn. She was very worried about you." Grandpa Elk continued to talk to the little Bigfoot, almost as if he believed the Bigfoot might comprehend and understand his every word. And maybe he did. "The wind is very bad out there. It's quite the blizzard. We're very glad you sought shelter in the barn, but we're worried about your condition. You might be rather ill, so we wanted to check your vitals to see if you're all right. If you have an infection, maybe, because if you do, I'd like to inject you, if I may, with some antibiotic and some steroids. It'll be a couple of pricks in the arm, but it should make you feel much more comfortable." "So it's alive?" asked Karen, looking over at her grandfather expectantly, with an expression of gratitude sweeping across her young face, because by the way her grandfather had been talking to the Bigfoot, she assumed that at least he was breathing. Grandpa Elk nodded. "I can feel the heartbeat, but it's worryingly slow, I have to say. The chest is very congested. The poor creature has clearly got some kind of chest infection, rather like pneumonia. Perhaps it needs antibiotics and steroids. I'm talking to him in the hope that he might understand me, but I'm not sure if he does." It was in that moment the little Bigfoot groaned and sat up very suddenly, its frightened dark eyes darting from both Karen to Elk. But it was too weak to bounce up from the floor to its feet, and seemed rather resigned to its plight, whatever that might be. The Bigfoot was breathing heavily, and fluid was running out of its nose. The poor little mite was not doing well, and that was very clear to see, and Karen's heart went out to the poor little creature, being alone in a stranger's barn like this, far away from its parents. The Bigfoot then fell back into its original fetal position and continued to sleep, as if it no longer cared or was concerned of the threat that Karen or her grandfather might actually impose to it, as it was clearly far too weak to resist their attempts to help him. Karen could only hope the little Bigfoot knew that they were there to help him.
"He needs antibiotics and steroids fast,"
said Grandpa Elk, opening up his medical emergency kit and pulling out a needle.
"The poor little Bigfoot could die if we don't help him. This infection is very bad, but the Bigfoot's a tough creature. I'm glad it found the barn to seek out shelter for itself, but I do wonder where its family is. I imagine they must be very concerned about his whereabouts."
"You think he got lost in the blizzard, Grandpa? There's quite a fog out there, and it's getting worse by the second. It would be so easy to lose your way, especially if you're sickly, as this disorientated little Bigfoot is clearly. The poor thing is so scared of us, but it's too weak to react to us in any way."
"I suspect you're right about that," said Grandpa Elk.
"What are you going to do?" asked Karen, as she watched her grandfather inject the little Bigfoot with a powerful concoction of antibiotics and steroids.
"Well, you can see I'm injecting the little creature here with some antibiotics and steroids," he said. "It could do with an IV drip and some intravenous fluids as well, but we're doing the best we can in the circumstances. I think Bigfoots are tougher and more robust than human beings are, so he does have a fighting chance of survival and making a full recovery. We just need to keep our fingers crossed for him."
Elk lifted up the Bigfoot's rather floppy head and began soaking a sponge with some distilled water that he'd brought along in his medical chest, and began to squeeze the water into the little Bigfoot's mouth. The Bigfoot responded and sucked the sponge very thirstily. It seemed grateful to drink up the water. Karen was sure that the little Bigfoot must sense that they were trying their level best to help him. Elk wrapped the Bigfoot in a warm blanket, and then strategically placed the ham sandwich and bottle of eggnog his granddaughter had brought along with her at his side. The little Bigfoot was still wearing the silvery tinsel from the Christmas sapling around his neck.
"You get better, little one," said Elk tenderly. "Keep warm under the blanket. You rarely feel very cold to the touch. We better get back," he told Karen. "We don't want your grandmother to know we've been out on an intrepid journey together in this insane blizzard. She wouldn't be best pleased with us if she knew that."
Karen nodded and obediently followed her grandfather, for she knew all too well how Granny Dora would react if she even had the slightest inkling what they had been up to. If their secret was uncovered, Granny Dora would likely shower them with the cold blasts of her furious indignance that would easily rival the icy cold air of the tundra. Grandpa Elk and Karen left the barn, only to be greeted by the wind beating furiously against their faces in icy blasts. Some of the snow had settled on Karen's eyelashes, and even on the end of her nose, burning her skin. Karen thought little about the unkind weather that beat so angrily against their clothes, for her thoughts were literally focused on the little Bigfoot. She was hoping that by Christmas morning they would return to the barn to find that little Bigfoot had fully recovered.
"Don't tell your grandmother about our little adventure, love,"
Elk warned his granddaughter as they waded through the snow, leaving behind 2 trails of footsteps that if Granny Dora were to look out of the window she would likely see.
"Let this be our secret."
"Why shouldn't we tell Granny Dora about this?" asked Karen.
"Your grandmother believes that the strongest in nature should survive, and that when animals die, it's part of the natural flow of things. She doesn't ever believe in interfering with wildlife in any way, if you know what I mean."
"But it's not a wild animal, Grandpa," said Karen insistently. "The Bigfoot is practically human. We had to help it. Do you think it will survive, Grandpa? Please say it will survive. It's Christmas Day tomorrow, and I want the Bigfoot to make it. He's so cute, and he could easily be human if it wasn't for all the hair all over its body."
That is certainly true, love. I'm quite surprised by how human the Bigfoot is. But I don't want you to get your hopes up, do you understand? As I was saying, I think the little Bigfoot is hardwired to be robust. These creatures would never survive in the wild if they were not. After Rick's story over his encounter with the Bigfoot that he met at the creek, I thought talking to the little thing might reassure him. He certainly seemed extremely grateful for the water I sponged into his mouth. He should feel a lot better after the antibiotics and steroids have done their job. I'll look in on the Bigfoot tomorrow morning. Hopefully the weather won't be as formidable by then, but I can't be sure about that. If the little Bigfoot dies, I don't want you to be upset, Karen. Promise me you won't get upset. At the best of times, nature can be cruel, especially out here in Alaska.
But he's not going to die, Grandpa Elk, Karen insisted. He just can't die. I won't let him. Tomorrow's Christmas. He can't die on Christmas Day. He can't, Grandpa Elk.
Well, we'll just have to pray for a Christmas miracle and hope that God will answer our prayers.
Where on earth have you been, Elk? Asked Granny Dora, not looking remotely impressed, when Karen and her grandfather entered the cabin, trailing dollops of snow into the Persian rug in the entrance hall. Granny Dora frowned, the edges of her lips drawing downwards, while she thrust her arms on her hips defiantly, and gave her husband Elk a challenging, no-nonsense look, which would have scared off many men, for when Granny Dora wanted to be, she could be quite formidable at the best of times.
"What do you mean by going out of doors in this god-awful weather, Elk?" she demanded. "For goodness sake! There's a blizzard blowing out there. The visibility is very poor. The wind is raging. What on earth were you thinking taking little Karen out of doors in these treacherous, ungodly conditions? She's only 12 years old, for God's sake, and she's not used to weather as treacherously inhospitable as this." "Look, love, keep your hair on, will you?" said Elk, trying to calm down Granny Dora's pronounced panic. She was trembling with relief to see that Karen and Elk were now safely back indoors, but also incredibly angry with her husband for venturing out of doors in the blizzard in the first place. As far as she was concerned, this was incongruous behaviour on her husband's part. But to drag Karen along with him outside was senselessly foolish. Dora Wheaton had been unable to believe the bloody-mindedness of her husband. She couldn't help but feel very aggrieved. Still, it was Christmas, she told herself firmly, and she didn't want to ruin the Christmas spirit by being a sourpuss, especially not when her granddaughter Karen was around, for she was eager to make Karen's Christmas as magical as she possibly could. Even so, that annoying husband of hers was the absolute end. She'd have to give him a big telling off when Karen's back was turned away. "Sorry, Granny Dora," said Karen, leaping at once to her grandfather's defence. "I was worried about some of the tinsel that you and I put on the sapling out of doors, because it appears to have blown away," she lied, trying to find a creative excuse for her and her grandfather's impromptu trip out of doors. "It's my fault, Granny Dora. Don't blame Grandpa Elk for this. I was the one that persuaded him to take me out of doors in the first place. I was hoping Grandpa Elk could help me recover the silvery tinsel that you and I wrapped around the tree. But when we both went to look for it, it was gone." This part Karen knew was absolutely true, for the silvery tinsel was currently wrapped around the little Bigfoot's neck. "I think the tinsel must have blown away, Granny Dora," she said, forcing her voice to drop, so it almost sounded as if she was very sad about the piece of tinsel. Grandpa Elk passed his granddaughter a grateful look, for he knew he didn't have a good excuse himself for escorting his granddaughter out of doors, with the wind blowing so fiercely that it had practically almost blown them to their knees, as fighting against a rambunctious wind like that was not for the faint-hearted by any manner of means. Granny Dora was not amused, but she tried her level best to compose herself, especially since her granddaughter looked so dreadfully sad about the silvery tinsel that must have blown far away by now. Granny Dora secretly chastised herself for ever suggesting that Karen should decorate the sapling out of doors in the first place. She couldn't believe that her husband Elk had actually agreed to take Karen out of doors to ludicrously chase after a bit of tinsel, with a raging blizzard blowing outside. What on earth was Elk thinking? Why couldn't he say no to his granddaughter?
Dora Wheaton's teeth were grinding together angrily as she pursed her lips tightly together, trying to appear as if she was in control of her emotions, when, if the truth be told, she actually wanted to explode with an irate indignation, which she struggled to suppress. Dora turned to her husband, her eyes narrowing as they fixed on Elk. Elk shuddered when Dora gave him that contemptuous look that he knew very well, because he knew if his wife were a cat, she'd have already scratched his eyes out by now. "You mean you went out of doors to help little Karen over here find a piece of tinsel that we draped over the sapling? Are you stark raving mad, Elk? Karen is only 12 years old, for goodness sake. She's a very small, slight little girl. The wind out there is feisty, let me tell you. I'm ashamed of you, Elk Wheaton. You should know better than that. What on earth were you thinking? If the decorations blow off the sapling outside, then leave them be. It's not the end of the world. Decorations can be easily replaced, but people cannot be. To be caught up in the blizzard is no laughing matter for anyone. Now come in, the both of you. Look at you, Karen. Your teeth are chattering, you poor thing," said Dora Wheaton, putting a protective arm around Karen and turning around to glare at her husband. "You better come to the fireside, Karen, and get nice and warm, and I'll make you a hot toddy with a drop of brandy in it." Karen had not realized how cold she actually was when she entered the cabin, as all her focus and thoughts were occupied on what she and Grandpa Elk could do to help the little Bigfoot. In her blind distraction, she had almost forgotten the cold, but when she stood by the warm crackling fire in the living room, her whole body began to thaw out. She sighed with relief when her cold fingers that felt as if they would drop off suddenly regained their feeling again. She felt so much better now, so much so that her body was lovely and warm. Finally she took off her outer garments and placed them on the hooks in the entrance hall, while she placed her boots on the boot rack along with all the other outdoor footwear that her grandparents owned. Soon Karen was happily drinking a hot toddy that her grandmother had brought her, laced with plenty of brandy, which really did make her whole body come to life. She had spent the entire afternoon playing all kinds of card games by the fire with Grandpa Elk. She had also potted around the kitchen to help Granny Dora with the seasonal fare for the Christmas celebration the following morning. The cabin was filled with the sumptuous aromas of Christmas, as well as Christmas songs that Grandpa Elk was playing throughout the day. Karen found herself spontaneously bopping to the music, but all the while she could not help but think of the little Bigfoot lying on the floor on the barn, covered in the warm blanket. She wished they'd brought the poor little mite into the warmth of the cabin, but Granny Dora might have been a bit shocked if that were to happen. She began to pray for the little Bigfoot in earnest, praying that God would bring a Christmas miracle of healing to the little thing. "Please make the Bigfoot better, God," she urged. "Please." It was on Christmas morning that Karen was delightfully greeted to the wonderful smells of nutmeg and cinnamon. The cabin was sumptuously cosy and inviting, and her first thoughts were to rush to the stocking hanging on the mantel above the fireplace, to see if it had been filled with all kinds of exciting goodies. And then Karen suddenly remembered the little Bigfoot lying in the barn, and her enthusiasm died down like a fire burning out in the crate. Karen knew she'd have easily given up all her Christmas presents this year in exchange for the little Bigfoot getting better. That would be a small price to pay, and the Bigfoot returning to good health would be the best Christmas present ever for her. "You're up already," said Granny Dora, smiling, as she saw her granddaughter in her warm pyjamas rushing over to the Christmas stocking on the mantel to see if it had been filled by Father Christmas. She was not disappointed. She could see the stocking was bulging in all kinds of exciting angles. "Oh, I see, Father Christmas has already been," said Granny Dora, smiling enthusiastically. "Father Christmas is very efficient, is he not? I mean, goodness gracious me. He managed to get through a really precarious blizzard, to come to our remote cabin in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night like that, with all these wonderful gifts for you." "Well," said Granny Dora somewhat impatiently, "let's see what Father Christmas has brought you, shall we, Karen? Hurry up, open your stocking." Karen found herself glancing briefly out of the window before she paid much attention to the stocking in her hand that was swinging around like a pendulum. She smiled as she looked at the toe area of the stocking, for she knew that it contained the customary orange that was always placed there every single year. "Are you all right, love?" asked Granny Dora.
If you don't mind my saying so, you look rather preoccupied and distracted. You keep glancing out of the living room window. Are you still worried about the piece of tinsel that blew away? I'm sure when the weather calms down we can find some more to replace it. It really isn't the end of the world. And if you must know, I still think the sapling looks beautiful with all that red ribbon on it.
It's not that, Granny Dora. I'm not worried about the tinsel. I was just wondering if there's still a blizzard outside, that's all. I was wondering if things had calmed down a little.
I'm afraid the tempestuous blizzard out of doors has a mind of its own, Karen dear. It doesn't look like it's going away any time soon. We're snowed in for a while, but we've got everything we need in the cabin. And I want to make sure we have a wonderful Christmas, all three of us together, like we do every year. Now, are you going to open your stocking or not?
Not until Grandpa Elk gets here, said Karen, who knew that her grandfather always enjoyed watching her screaming with delight when she opened up her Christmas stocking. But this Christmas things felt profoundly different for Karen. With a sick Bigfoot in their midst not far away from the cabin, it was very hard for her to think of anything else but the fate of the little Bigfoot. She clandestinely privately wondered when she and Grandpa Elk would get the opportunity to sneak out to see how the little fellow was doing, without Granny Dora finding out what they were getting up to behind her back. The blizzard out of doors was indomitably fearsome, blowing its forceful, unkind gusts unashamedly across the tundra at a whipping speed. The howls of the wind beat against the cabin like a witch's long fingernails, so that you could hear tapping sounds on all the windows, and sometimes the windows even rattled. The visibility outside the cabin was worse than ever, while the heat from the warm fire in the crate had caused some condensation to develop on the inside windows. All Karen could think about was whether the poor little Bigfoot had survived the night, for it really had been in a bad way. She hoped it had managed to eat the ham sandwich and drink some of the eggnog that she had left for it, to gain some much-needed strength. Was the Bigfoot even warm enough, she wondered? Was the blanket that Grandpa Elk had left for it enough for him? He might have been covered with hair, but the cold temperatures were insufferable. Karen pretended to be enthusiastic when she pulled out the presents from her stocking, which included some pretty socks, a box of crayons, watercolour pencils, some of her favourite gummy bears, a chocolate Father Christmas, a pretty necklace, a pair of warm slippers, a warm scarf and a pair of woolly mittens, and a cute little pink teddy bear. It was a miracle that all the stuff had managed to fit in the Christmas stocking, but then again her grandmother was ingenious at things like that. "Wow, these are lovely, these presents, I mean," said Karen excitedly, managing a smile. "Thank you, Granny Dora. Thank you, Grandpa Elk."
"But why are you thanking us, Karen dear? Father Christmas brought those gifts for you during the night, all the way from the North Pole," she insisted. Karen smiled at her grandmother. Did her grandmother really believe at 12 years old? She believed in all that nonsense. "Well then, Father Christmas is very clever," she said. "He certainly knows exactly what I need. The scarf and these gloves are absolutely perfect." She smiled at her grandmother warmly, who beamed back brightly, for Granny Dora loved nothing better than to see her granddaughter smile. It was when Granny Dora insisted that Karen and Elk entertain themselves in the living room. It was while she buried herself in the kitchen that Elk indicated to his granddaughter that now was the time to go out of doors to the barn, while Granny Dora was currently distracted, peeling potatoes and preparing the Christmas turkey. So there we are, that's the end of part 3. Part 4 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good